The crowd fell silent as Naomi Jenkins stepped onto the courthouse steps, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her pale skin. Her dark curls fell loosely around her shoulders, damp with nervous sweat despite the cool April morning in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. It was 1878, and the bustling frontier town had gathered for what had become an increasingly common spectacle, a debt auction that would determine the fate of the young woman who stood trembling before them. 5 feet 4 inches tall, 20 years of age, capable of cooking, cleaning, and sewing, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the dusty square. Miss Jenkins is being sold to cover her late father's debts. Bidding starts at $50. Naomi closed her eyes, willing away the tears that threatened to fall. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been tending to her ailing father in their modest farmhouse. Then the fever had taken him, leaving her alone with nothing but mounting debts and creditors at the door. The law had been clear, with no male relatives to assume the debt and no way to pay it herself. She would serve as indentured labor until the debt was settled. The bidding began, men's voices calling out numbers that determined her worth, her future. Naomi forced herself to look at them ranch hands, shopkeepers, and the town's wealthy widower who watched her with calculating eyes. $75, called a burly man with tobacco-stained teeth. 80, countered another. 100, said the widower, his thin lips curling into a smile that made Naomi's stomach turn. The bids climbed higher, reaching $120 when a commotion at the back of the crowd drew everyone's attention. A tall man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion pushed through the throng. He dismounted with fluid grace, the spurs on his worn leather boots jingling as he approached the steps. $200, he called out, his voice deep and steady. The crowd murmured in surprise. The man stood at least 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders covered by a weathered duster coat. A worn Stetson hat shadowed his face, but Naomi could see his strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. He looked up, and Naomi found herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she had ever seen. 200 going once, the auctioneer called, looking around at the stunned crowd. 250, the widower sputtered, his face reddening. The newcomer didn't even look at him. 300, he countered without hesitation. The widower opened his mouth to speak again, but the stranger fixed him with a cold stare. I've got 500 in gold if anyone else wants to try, he said quietly, but his voice carried in the silence. No one spoke. 300 going once, going twice. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a decisive crack. The stranger stepped forward, pulling a leather pouch from inside his coat. He counted out the money, handed it to the auctioneer, then turned to Naomi. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, putting him somewhere in his late 20s. He pulled a knife from his belt, and Naomi flinched, but he merely sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. Name's Hank Ironwood, he said, his voice gentler now. Come on. Naomi rubbed her chafed wrists, confusion and fear warring within her. Where are we going? Away from here, he said, leading her toward his horse. Unless you'd rather stay. Naomi glanced back at the courthouse, at the faces of the men who had bid on her like cattle, at the town that had watched her humiliation without protest. She had nothing here, not anymore. No, she said firmly. I don't want to stay. Hank nodded once, then helped her onto his horse before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, creating a protective cage that should have made her feel trapped, but somehow didn't. Hold on, he murmured near her ear. Then he clicked his tongue, and the horse lurched forward, carrying them away from Fort Sumner at a steady trot. As they rode out of town, Naomi's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had he paid so much for her? What did he expect in return? The questions swirled in her mind, but the alternative, being sold to one of the other bidders, had been unthinkable. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through scrubland and rocky outcroppings. Finally, as they crested a small rise, Naomi saw a modest homestead in the distance, a sturdy log cabin with a barn and corral nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees that suggested a nearby water source. "Is that your home?" she asked, breaking the silence. "It is now," Hank replied. "Been here about 8 months. As they drew closer, Naomi could see that the cabin was well built but simple. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a small vegetable garden was taking shape to one side. Hank helped her down from the horse once they reached the yard. Naomi's legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her before quickly releasing her. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for what he'd done, but all she had to offer at the moment. He nodded, then led his horse toward the barn. "I'll see to Rusty. Make yourself at home." Naomi stood uncertainly in the yard before making her way to the cabin door. She pushed it open, finding herself in a single large room that served as both kitchen and living area. A cast iron stove stood against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center, and a narrow bed was tucked into the far corner. Everything was neat but sparse, clearly the dwelling of a solitary man. She turned at the sound of boots on the wooden steps and watched as Hank ducked through the doorway, removing his hat as he entered. In the better light of the cabin, she could see him clearly for the first time. His hair was a dark brown, almost black, and though it was in need of a trim, it suited his rugged features. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. "You must be hungry," he said, moving to the stove and stoking the banked fire. "I am," she admitted. "But first, Mr. Ironwood, I need to understand what's happened. Why did you buy me? What do you expect from me?" Hank straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I didn't buy you, Miss Jenkins. I paid your father's debt. There's a difference. But why? You don't know me." He turned away, busying himself with a coffee pot. "I know what it's like to be at the mercy of others." He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "You'll have your own space. There's a small room off the back I use for storage. We can clear it out, make it proper for you." "And what do you want in return?" Naomi pressed, needing to know the terms of her new arrangement. "Help with the place would be welcome. Cooking, maybe tend the garden." He paused. "When the debt's worked off, you'll be free to go." Naomi studied him, looking for deception, for the hidden motives men so often had. But his gaze remained steady, open. "And how long will that take?" "Depends on how we calculate your work. We can figure that out." It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than what might have awaited her with any of the other bidders. "All right," she said finally. "I accept your terms." Something that might have been relief flickered across Hank's face. "Good." He pointed to a shelf. "There's jerky and biscuits there if you're hungry now. I'll bring in your things." "My things?" Naomi asked in surprise. "I stopped by the sheriff's office before the auction. Made sure they set aside what was yours by right. Not much, I'm afraid." Naomi felt a swell of emotion at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you." Hank merely nodded and headed back outside. Naomi moved to the shelf and found the food he'd mentioned, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. As she ate a biscuit, she looked around the cabin again, trying to reconcile this strange turn of events. A man she'd never met had spent a small fortune to free her from public auction, brought her to his home, and now offered her fair terms for working off the debt. It seemed too good to be true, and in Naomi's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But for now, she had food, shelter, and a chance to maintain her dignity. It was more than she'd had this morning, and for the moment, that would have to be enough. The next few days established a tentative routine. True to his word, Hank cleared out the small back room, adding a narrow bed, a small chest for her few belongings, and even hanging a piece of canvas as a makeshift door for privacy. Naomi took over the cooking and began putting the neglected garden in proper order. They worked side by side during the day but spoke little. At night, they retreated to their separate spaces, the silence between them growing more comfortable but no less mysterious. On the fourth morning, Naomi woke before dawn, as had become her habit. She quietly stoked the fire in the stove and began preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. The familiar tasks calmed her, giving her time to think. Hank emerged from outside just as she was setting the table, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and horses. He'd already been out seeing to the livestock, a task he insisted on handling himself. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Smells good." "It's just mush," Naomi replied, "but I found some honey on the shelf. It helps." They ate in companionable silence until Naomi finally gathered her courage to ask what had been on her mind. "Mr. Ironwood, Hank," he corrected. "No need for formality." "Hank," she amended. "I've been wondering about the debt. How much exactly am I working to repay?" He looked up from his bowl, a slight frown creasing his brow. $300 was the auction price, but your father's actual debt was $185, according to the court records. "Then I'll work to repay the $185, Naomi said firmly. "That seems fair." He paused, then added, "We should agree on wages. What would be standard for a housekeeper and cook in town?" Naomi considered this. "Maybe $20 a month plus room and board for full-time work." Hank nodded. "So 9 months and a bit, then you're square." 9 months. The time frame stretched before her, simultaneously a prison sentence and a reprieve. "And you'll truly let me go then? No additional terms or conditions?" Something flashed in his eyes, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. "I'm a man of my word, Miss Jenkins. I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. It's just uncommon what you did, taking on a stranger's debt." Hank pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Nothing uncommon about basic decency. I've got work to do on the north fence today. Won't be back till sundown." Before Naomi could respond, he grabbed his hat and strode out the door, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the dirty dishes. She sighed, berating herself for questioning his motives when he'd shown nothing but respect and consideration. As she washed the breakfast things, Naomi took stock of her situation. The cabin, while basic, was clean and solid. The garden would yield fresh vegetables soon if properly tended. There was a small stream nearby for water, and game was plentiful in the surrounding areas. It was a hard life, but an honest one. With the dishes done, Naomi decided to thoroughly clean the cabin. She swept the floor, dusted the few shelves, and discovered a tattered Bible tucked between spare ammunition and a mending kit. Opening it, she found an inscription inside the cover. "To my son Hank, may you find your way home. With love, Mother, 1870. Naomi carefully replaced the Bible, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private. Her curiosity about Hank Ironwood only grew. Where was he from? Why was he alone out here? What had driven him to Fort Sumner on the very day of her auction? After finishing her indoor chores, Naomi turned her attention to the garden. The sun was warm on her back as she weeded between rows of young plants. It was peaceful work, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps things might turn out all right after all. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the approaching horses until they were nearly upon the cabin. Looking up, She saw 3 riders approaching from the east, their mounts kicking up dust as they entered the yard. Naomi stood, wiping her hands on her apron as the men dismounted. They were rough-looking, trail-worn, with the hard eyes of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Well, well," the lead man said, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Ironwood's got himself a woman." "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Naomi asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're looking for Ironwood," a second man said, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made Naomi want to shrink into herself. "He's not here," she replied, taking a step back toward the cabin. "He's mending fences and won't be back until evening." The first man chuckled. "Ain't that convenient?" He looked to his companions. "Boys, I think we just found ourselves some hospitality while we wait." Fear shot through Naomi as the men advanced toward her. She turned and ran for the cabin, reaching the door just steps ahead of them. Once inside, she slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. "Now, don't be like that, sweetheart," one of the men called through the door. "We just want to be neighborly." Naomi's heart pounded as she looked around for a weapon. She spotted Hank's rifle hanging above the fireplace and rushed to grab it, praying it was loaded. The men were now at the windows peering in, their faces twisted in malicious grins. "Come on out, or we'll break the door down," the leader threatened. Naomi cocked the rifle, the sound loud in the small cabin. "I know how to use this," she called back, her voice stronger than she felt. "The first man through that door gets a bullet." There was a moment of silence, then laughter. "She's got spirit, boys, I like that." "I'm not alone," Naomi lied desperately. "Mr. Ironwood's hands will be back any minute." "Ironwood ain't got no hands," one of the men scoffed. "Just him and now you, apparently." The sound of splintering wood told Naomi they were trying to force the door. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, aiming at the entrance, her finger trembling on the trigger. The crash of a gunshot made her jump, but it hadn't come from her rifle. It was followed by another, and then a man's voice, Hank's voice, cold and commanding. "Step away from my door, Reeves, or the next bullet won't be a warning." The attempted break-in immediately stopped. Naomi moved cautiously to the window and peered out to see Hank sitting atop his horse, a smoking revolver in his hand. The 3 men had backed away from the cabin, their hands raised slightly. "Now, Ironwood," the leader Reeves said with a forced smile. "No need for this to get ugly. We were just passing by, thought we'd say hello." "Say it from your saddles, then get off my land," Hank replied, his voice hard as iron. The tension in the yard was palpable as the 3 men slowly backed toward their horses, keeping their eyes on Hank. "This ain't over," Reeves muttered as he mounted. "It is if you're smart," Hank countered. "Ride." The men departed, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Hank remained mounted, watching until they were well out of sight before dismounting and approaching the cabin. "Naomi," he called, "are you all right?" She unbarred the door with shaking hands and opened it to find Hank standing there, concern etched on his face. "Yes," she managed, still clutching the rifle. "They didn't. I'm fine." Relief washed over his features. "Good." He gently took the rifle from her hands. "You handled yourself well." "I was terrified," she admitted, suddenly feeling weak-kneed now that the danger had passed. Hank guided her to a chair, then poured her a cup of water from the bucket by the stove. "Drink." She sipped the cool water, watching as he checked the windows and door for damage. "Who were they?" she asked finally. "Trouble," Hank replied grimly. "Reeves and his boys fancy themselves outlaws, though they're mostly just thieves and bullies." He paused, looking troubled. "I should have warned you about them." "Why did they come here?" Hank ran a hand through his hair. "They've tried to push me off this land before. It's good grazing with reliable water. They want it." And they'll be back, Naomi said, understanding dawning, probably. Hank's jaw tightened. But not tonight. They know better than to try again so soon. Naomi nodded, trying to process everything that had happened. You came back early, from the fencing. Forgot my canteen, Hank said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Lucky mistake. The understatement made Naomi laugh despite herself, a slightly hysterical sound that nevertheless released some of the tension coiled within her. Very lucky. Hank's expression softened at her laughter. You're sure you're all right? I am now, she assured him, suddenly aware of how different he looked when concern replaced his usual stoicism. It transformed his face, made him seem younger, more vulnerable. He held her gaze for a long moment, then cleared his throat and turned away. I'll stay close to the house for the rest of the day. The fence can wait. That night, after a quiet dinner, Naomi found herself unable to sleep. The day's events kept replaying in her mind the threatening men, Hank's timely return, the way he'd looked at her with genuine concern. She tossed and turned on her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds through the small window in her room. A creak from the main room caught her attention. Through the canvas partition, she could see Hank's silhouette as he moved to the front door and stepped outside. Curiosity overcame her caution, and she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders before following him. Hank stood on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. He didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence. Can't sleep? He asked quietly. No, Naomi admitted, coming to stand beside him. Too much happened today. I'm sorry you were put in danger, Hank said, still looking up at the stars. That wasn't part of our arrangement. It wasn't your fault, Naomi replied. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for coming back when you did. Hank finally looked at her, his expression inscrutable in the moonlight. I should never have left you alone. You couldn't have known they would come. I should have. Reeves has been watching the place. I've seen his tracks. He shook his head. I was careless. They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool around them. Naomi found herself studying Hank's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Why did you really buy my contract? She asked suddenly, the question that had been burning within her since the auction finally emerging. Hank's shoulders tensed, but he didn't look away from her. I told you, I know what it's like to be at others' mercy. There's more to it than that, Naomi pressed gently. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, My sister. Your sister? Hank's hands gripped the porch railing. Her name was Hannah. After our parents died, we had nothing but debts. I was 16, she was 17. I went to work in the mines, but it wasn't enough. His voice grew rough. They sold her contract to pay what we owed, to a man named Blackburn who owned a saloon in Denver. Naomi's heart clenched. What happened to her? She died 2 years later. Consumption, they said, but... He shook his head. She was broken long before the disease took her. I'm so sorry, Naomi whispered, understanding now why he had acted as he had. When I saw you on those steps, Hank continued, all I could see was Hannah. I couldn't let it happen again, not when I had the means to stop it. Impulsively, Naomi reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. What you did was good and brave. Hank looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers curling gently around hers. It wasn't bravery, it was penance. They stood like that, hands joined as the night deepened around them. Something had shifted between them, a door opening to understanding and perhaps something more. Eventually, Hank released her hand. You should try to sleep, he said softly. Tomorrow will come early. Naomi nodded, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment standing beneath the stars in her nightclothes with this man who was still largely a mystery to her. Good night, Hank. As she turned to go inside, he spoke again. "Naomi," she paused, looking back at him. "Yes." "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. Naomi smiled, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. "So am I." The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to the homestead and to the relationship between Hank and Naomi. Spring blossomed fully into early summer, and the garden flourished under Naomi's care. Hank taught her to shoot properly, standing close behind her to correct her aim, his presence solid and reassuring. In return, Naomi coaxed recipes from memory to vary their meals and even convinced Hank to let her cut his hair when it grew too long for comfort. They developed a comfortable rhythm, working together during the day and often sitting on the porch in the evenings, talking about their pasts, their hopes, the books they had read. Naomi learned that Hank had educated himself after leaving the mines, devouring any printed material he could find. He revealed that he had worked as a bounty hunter for a time, before deciding to settle on this land and build something lasting. Naomi shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, her mother who had died when she was 12, the string of increasingly desperate homesteads her father had established and abandoned before his final illness in Fort Sumner. She spoke of her love for music, how she had once played the piano in their church back home, and how much she missed it. 2 months after her arrival, Hank rode into Fort Sumner for supplies and returned with something wrapped in burlap tied to his saddle. When Naomi unwrapped it, she found a small lap harp, its wood worn but its strings intact. "It's not a piano," he said, almost apologetically. "Found it at the mercantile. Owner said it came off a wagon train headed west. Family needed the money more than the music." Tears sprang to Naomi's eyes as she ran her fingers over the strings, producing a soft, sweet chord. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But Hank, this must have cost—" "Don't worry about the cost," he interrupted. "It's not part of your debt. It's a gift." That evening, after dinner, Naomi brought the harp onto the porch and began to play. The simple melodies filled the twilight air, bringing a touch of gentleness to the rugged landscape. Hank sat beside her, watching her fingers dance across the strings with an expression that made her heart beat faster when she caught glimpses of it. As summer progressed, they became more attuned to each other, anticipating needs, finishing thoughts. Naomi found herself watching Hank when he didn't notice the way he moved with quiet confidence, the rare but transformative smile that lit his face, the gentleness with which he treated injured animals and tender plants alike. And sometimes, she would look up from her work to find his eyes on her, a warmth in them that made her cheeks flush and her pulse quicken. At night, in the privacy of her small room, she would wonder what it might be like if their arrangement were different, if they were together by choice rather than circumstance. But always, the knowledge of her indenture stood between them, an invisible barrier neither seemed willing to breach. Naomi was determined to pay her debt honorably, and Hank appeared equally determined to maintain the propriety of their situation. Then came the day that changed everything. It began like any other, with breakfast shared in companionable conversation. Hank mentioned riding out to check the western boundary of his property, where he'd spotted signs of wild horses that might be worth taming. Naomi planned to preserve some of the summer vegetables that had ripened in abundance. "I'll be back before sundown," Hank said, settling his hat on his head as he prepared to leave. "Don't open the door for anyone." "I won't," Naomi promised, having taken this precaution seriously since the incident with Reeves and his men, who had not returned but remained a lingering threat. Hank paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Be careful," he said softly, then was gone. Naomi spent the morning in the garden, harvesting beans and tomatoes in the growing heat. By midday, the temperature had risen to an uncomfortable level, and she retreated to the relative coolness of the cabin to begin the preserving process. She had just set the large pot of water to boil when she heard the distinctive sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving at speed. Her heart sank as she peered cautiously through the window. 5 men rode into the yard, and her blood ran cold when she recognized Reeves among them. Moving quickly, Naomi grabbed Hank's rifle from above the fireplace and checked that it was loaded. Then she barred the door and positioned herself where she could see anyone approaching from either the door or windows. Come out, little bird," Reeves called mockingly. "Ironwood's a long way from home and we've got all day." "Leave now," Naomi shouted back. "I've got a rifle and I know how to use it." Laughter greeted her threat. "1 rifle against 5 of us. Those ain't good odds, sweetheart." Naomi's mind raced. 5 men meant 10 guns at least. The cabin's walls were solid wood, but not thick enough to stop bullets if they decided to simply fire through them. She needed a strategy. "What do you want?" she called, hoping to buy time. "Well, now, that's a fine question," Reeves replied. "First, we want Ironwood's gold. We know he's got a stash somewhere. Then we might just take this nice little piece of land." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a menacing tone. "And then there's you, pretty thing." Naomi's blood ran cold at the implication, but she forced herself to remain calm. "There's no gold here," she replied. "Just a working farm." "We'll be the judge of that," Reeves said. "Boys, check the barn and outbuildings. Me and Tully will keep an eye on the house." Naomi watched through the window as 3 of the men dismounted and headed toward the barn. That left 2 watching the cabin. Slightly better odds, but still not good. She tried to remember everything Hank had taught her about shooting: steady breathing, firm grip, squeeze, don't pull. A sudden crash from the back of the cabin made her jump and swing the rifle around. One of the men must have circled behind while she was focused on Reeves. She heard the sound of breaking glass. They were trying to get in through her bedroom window. Naomi moved to the canvas partition and fired a shot through it, aiming high to scare rather than kill. A startled curse told her she had at least surprised the intruder. "Next one goes lower," she warned, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound confident. The momentary victory was short-lived. A barrage of gunfire suddenly peppered the front of the cabin, bullets thudding into the wooden walls. Naomi dropped to the floor, covering her head as splinters flew. They were trying to force her down while their companions broke in from behind. She crawled across the floor, keeping low, and reached her bedroom just as a man was pulling himself through the broken window. Naomi fired without hesitation, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and sending him tumbling back outside with a howl of pain. More gunfire answered her shot, and Naomi retreated to the main room, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear over the rush of blood in her ears. The water she'd put on to boil was now steaming violently, forgotten in the chaos. "You're only making this worse for yourself," Reeves shouted. "Come out now, and maybe we won't burn the place down around you." Naomi bit her lip, trying to think. They wouldn't burn the cabin if they truly believed there was gold hidden inside, but they might set a small fire to smoke her out. The rifle had 5 shots left, not enough to hold off all of them if they rushed the cabin at once. A new sound cut through her panic, a sharp whistle, distinctive and familiar. Hank's signal when returning from hunting, so she wouldn't be startled. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by fear for his safety. 5 against 1 were terrible odds, even for someone as capable as Hank. The whistle had caught Reeves' attention too. Well, he called to his men. "Looks like the owner's come home early. Spread out, boys." Naomi moved to the window, desperate for a glimpse of Hank. What she saw made her gasp. He wasn't alone. At least half a dozen riders accompanied him, all armed and spreading out to surround Reeves and his gang. "Reeves," Hank's voice carried clearly across the yard. "You've made a serious mistake today." "Ironwood," Reeves replied, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. "This is between you and me. Tell your friends to back off." "These aren't friends," Hank replied coldly. "They're the law. U.S. Marshal Patterson and his deputies have been tracking you since that bank job in Las Cruces." Naomi watched in amazement as the situation rapidly reversed. Reeves and his remaining men found themselves outgunned and surrounded, with nowhere to run. "Throw down your weapons," ordered a tall man who must have been the marshal. "You're under arrest for robbery, assault, and attempted murder." For a moment, it seemed Reeves might resist, his hand hovering near his gun. But a quick glance at the odds facing him evidently changed his mind. With a curse, he dropped his weapon, his men following suit. As the deputies moved in to handcuff the outlaws, Hank dismounted and ran to the cabin. "Naomi," he called, his voice ragged with worry. "Naomi, answer me." "I'm here," she called back, unbarring the door with shaking hands. "I'm all right." The door flew open, and Hank stood there, his face pale beneath his tan, his eyes wild as they searched her for injuries. "Are you hurt? I heard shots." "No, I'm not hurt," Naomi assured him, though now that the danger had passed, she found herself trembling uncontrollably. "I shot one of them." "In the shoulder. He was coming through the window." Relief washed over Hank's features, followed by a fierce pride. "Good girl," he breathed, and then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Naomi clung to him, burying her face against his chest as the fear and tension of the last hour finally overwhelmed her. She felt his heart hammering against her cheek, as fast as her own. "I thought I'd lost you," Hank murmured into her hair, "when I saw them riding toward the house." "How did you know?" Naomi asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Hank loosened his hold slightly but didn't let her go. "I was checking the West Ridge when I spotted their tracks heading this way. Fresh, moving fast. I knew what it meant." He shook his head. "I rode for the marshal's camp." "Patterson's been after Reeves for months." They were camped just 3 miles out, waiting for word on his whereabouts. "Lucky coincidence," Naomi said, looking up at him. "Not coincidence," Hank replied. "I've been keeping tabs on their camp just in case Reeves ever came back." His hand came up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "I swore I'd keep you safe." Something in his gaze made Naomi's breath catch. The concern and relief were there, yes, but something more, a tenderness, a longing that matched the feelings she'd been carefully guarding in her own heart. The moment was broken by the approach of Marshal Patterson, his spurs jingling as he stepped onto the porch. Hank released Naomi reluctantly, though he kept one hand at the small of her back. "They're secured," the marshal said. "The wounded one needs tending, but he'll live to stand trial." He tipped his hat to Naomi. "Madam, that was brave work, holding them off alone." "Thank you, Marshal," Naomi replied, finding her composure. "And thank you for coming so quickly." Patterson nodded. "Been after Reeves for a while now. Robbed 3 banks in the territory, killed a teller in the last one." He glanced at the bullet holes in the cabin walls. "You folks are lucky." "Yes," Hank agreed, his hand warm against Naomi's back. "We are." After the marshal and his deputies departed with their prisoners, Hank and Naomi were left to assess the damage to the cabin. The broken window would need repair, and several bullets had penetrated the walls, but the structure itself was sound. As they worked together to board up the window until proper glass could be obtained, Naomi found herself stealing glances at Hank. Something fundamental had changed between them today, the way he had held her, the look in his eyes, the protective hand he'd kept near her even as they spoke with the marshal. Night fell, and they prepared a simple dinner, neither mentioning the charged atmosphere that seemed to fill the cabin. They ate in relative silence, exhaustion from the day's events settling over them. "You should rest," Hank said finally as they cleared the dishes. "It's been a long day." Naomi nodded, suddenly reluctant to retreat to her room to be alone with her thoughts. "Hank," she said, catching his arm as he turned away, "thank you for coming back in time." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face. "I will always come back for you, Naomi," he said, his voice low and intense. "Always." The declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Naomi felt herself drawn toward him, her body swaying slightly forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. Hank's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in them. Naomi answered by closing the distance between them, her hand sliding up his arm to his shoulder. For a heartbeat, they stood suspended in the moment, breaths mingling, possibilities unfurling. Then Hank lowered his head and his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle as if she were made of porcelain, yet sure in their touch. Naomi leaned into him, her arms encircling his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him against her. The kiss deepened, speaking of fear overcome, of gratitude for life preserved, of feelings too long contained finally breaking free. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Hank pressed his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Why didn't you?" Naomi asked softly. "Because you're not free," he replied, pain evident in his words. "You're working off a debt. To me, I couldn't. I wouldn't take advantage of that." Naomi pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "Is that what you think? That kissing me would be taking advantage, wouldn't it?" Hank countered. "You're bound here by obligation, not choice." "I stayed because of the debt at first," Naomi acknowledged. "But that's not why I've been happy here." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm happy because of you, Hank, because of who you are, how you treat me, the life we've built together." Hope flared in his eyes. "Naomi, I care for you," she continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd begun. "More than I should, perhaps, given our arrangement, but today, when I thought I might die without ever telling you, I don't want to waste more time in silence." Hank's hands slid from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms to take her hands in his. "I care for you too," he said simply. "More than I've cared for anyone since Hannah died, maybe more than I've ever cared for anyone." He squeezed her hands. "But I need you to be truly free when you choose, not bound by debt or gratitude or fear." "What are you saying?" Naomi asked, her heart racing. "I'm saying your debt is paid," Hank replied, his gaze steady on hers. "As of today, you're free to go if that's what you want." Naomi stared at him, stunned by his words. "But I've only been here a little over 2 months. The arrangement was 9 months of work." "I don't care about the arrangement anymore," Hank said. "I care about you knowing your own mind, making your own choices." He released her hands and stepped back, creating space between them. "If you stay now, I want it to be because you want to be here, with me." The magnitude of what he was offering nearly overwhelmed Naomi. Freedom, a clean slate, the chance to go anywhere, do anything. And along with it, the truth of his feelings for her, laid bare without expectation or demand. "What if I need time to think?" she asked quietly. Pain flickered across Hank's face, but he nodded. "Then take it. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Naomi reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the stubble beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned and retreated to her room, closing the canvas partition behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Freedom was what she had longed for since her father's death, since the moment she'd been led onto those courthouse steps in Fort Sumner. Now it was hers, unexpectedly and completely. But what would she do with it? Where would she go? The thought of leaving the cabin, leaving Hank, created a hollow ache in her chest. In the weeks she had been here, this place had become more of a home than any of the temporary dwellings her father had established. And Hank. Hank had become essential to her happiness in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged until today. As the night deepened around her, Naomi lay on her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Hank moving about in the main room, banking the fire, checking the door. Rituals of safety and care that had come to represent security in her uncertain world. She must have eventually drifted off, for she woke to pale dawn light filtering through the boarded window. For a moment, she lay still, the events of the previous day washing over her anew. Then, with sudden clarity, she knew what she wanted. Naomi rose, dressed quickly, and stepped through the canvas partition into the main room. Hank was already up, his back to her as he stoked the fire in the stove. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his expression guarded, uncertain. "Good morning," he said cautiously. "Good morning," she replied, moving toward him with purposeful steps. When she reached him, she took a deep breath and said, "I've made my decision." Hank's posture stiffened slightly, bracing for her words. "And I'm staying," Naomi said simply. "Not because of the debt, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. With you." The transformation of Hank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once brilliant with light. "You're sure?" he asked, hope making his voice unsteady. "I've never been more sure of anything," Naomi affirmed, reaching for his hands. "I want to build a life here, our life together." Hank pulled her to him then, his arms encircling her waist as he looked down into her face with a joy so profound it took her breath away. "I love you, Naomi Jenkins," he said, the words ringing with truth and promise. "I think I have since I first saw you on those courthouse steps." "And I love you, Hank Ironwood," she replied, her heart so full it seemed it might burst. From enemy to protector to friend. "And now to my heart's choice." When he kissed her this time, it was with the freedom of barriers fallen, of truths acknowledged, of futures merging into one shared path. Naomi gave herself to the kiss completely, knowing that her decision had not been a difficult one. After all, her heart had known its home long before her mind had caught up. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, Naomi's head resting on Hank's shoulder as she softly played her harp, he asked, "What would you like to do now that you're free? Anything you want, it's yours." Naomi considered the question, her fingers still moving over the strings. "I'd like to plant fruit trees," she said finally. "Apple, pear, maybe cherry if they'll grow here. Something that will last, that will grow with us over the years." Hank pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Trees it is. What else?" she smiled, leaning into him. "I'd like to write to my friend Elizabeth in Fort Sumner, let her know I'm all right, maybe invite her to visit." "Of course," Hank agreed. "And beyond that, there's a whole world out there, Naomi, places to see, things to do." Naomi set the harp aside and turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "The world can wait," she said softly. "For now, this is enough. You are enough." The tenderness in Hank's gaze nearly undid her. "I want to do this properly," he said, his voice low. "I want to court you as you deserve, not rush because of circumstance." "We have all the time in the world," Naomi assured him, touched by his consideration. "Even so," Hank replied, a hint of nervousness crossing his features. "I want you to know that this is real, that it's lasting." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I want you to have this. It was my mother's." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it. "It's not an engagement ring, not yet, unless you want it to be, but it's a promise, Naomi. A promise that for as long as you choose to stay, my heart is yours." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes as she looked at the ring, then up at Hank's earnest face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "And yes, I accept your promise and I make the same to you." Hank slipped the ring onto her right hand, a promise, not yet a formal engagement, and then kissed her knuckles, his lips lingering against her skin. "Thank you," he murmured, "for giving me a second chance at a family." "We'll build it together," Naomi promised, her heart so full of love it seemed impossible to contain it all. Day by day, season by season, the months that followed were filled with hard work, simple joys, and deepening love. True to his word, Hank courted Naomi with respectful devotion, bringing her wildflowers from his rides, carving a proper door for her room to replace the canvas partition, and ordering books from Santa Fe when he learned of her love for poetry. They planted the fruit trees Naomi had wished for, small saplings that would take years to bear fruit, a testament to their commitment to this place and to each other. They expanded the garden, repaired and improved the cabin, and began planning for additional rooms that would transform the simple structure into a proper home. Word spread through the scattered homesteads of the territory about Hank Ironwood and his lady, how they had faced down Reeves and his gang, how the confirmed bachelor had finally found his match. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now stopped by occasionally, bringing gifts of preserved foods or offers to help with barn raising or well digging. Through it all, Hank and Naomi's relationship deepened and matured. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and histories. They argued, sometimes Naomi's stubborn independence clashing with Hank's protective instincts, but always found their way back to understanding and compromise. By the time winter arrived, bringing with it shorter days and long evenings by the fire, they had established a partnership that went beyond romance to true companionship. They read to each other from Hank's growing collection of books, played games of checkers that Naomi usually won, and planned for the spring planting with optimism for the future. It was on Christmas Eve, with a rare snowfall blanketing the landscape outside and candles illuminating the cabin's interior, that Hank finally asked the question that had been in his heart since the day Naomi had chosen to stay. They had exchanged modest gifts, a new hat for Hank, knitted by Naomi's hands, and a journal with a leather cover for Naomi, ordered specially from Denver. As they sat before the fire, enjoying mugs of spiced cider, Hank took Naomi's hands in his. "These past months have been the happiest of my life," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves she could feel in his slightly trembling fingers. "Every day with you makes me more certain that what I found on those courthouse steps wasn't just a woman to save, but my own salvation." Naomi smiled, squeezing his hands encouragingly as he continued. "I know we agreed to take things slowly, to let our relationship grow naturally," Hank said, "and I've treasured every moment of that journey." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "But I find myself wanting more, Naomi. I want to call you my wife, to build not just a home but a family with you, to face whatever comes good or bad with you by my side, legally and in the eyes of God." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, not his mother's pearl band, which still adorned Naomi's right hand, but a new one with a small but brilliant diamond that caught the firelight. "Naomi Jenkins," Hank said, his voice dropping to that low, intense tone that never failed to make her heart race. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to Naomi's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then, finding her voice, she said, "Yes, Hank. Yes, with all my heart." His smile was radiant as he slipped the diamond ring onto her left hand, then leaned forward to seal the promise with a kiss that spoke of devotion, desire, and dreams shared. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Naomi rested her forehead against his. "From the auction block to a proposal by the fire," she murmured. "Life takes unexpected turns." "The best kind of turns," Hank agreed, drawing her close. "When I said come on that day, I never imagined where it would lead, but I'm eternally grateful it led to you." They were married on a clear, crisp day in February 1879, in the small church in Fort Sumner. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the handful of neighbors they had come to know, Marshall Patterson, who had helped save Naomi's life, and Elizabeth, Naomi's friend from town who had wept with joy upon receiving Naomi's letter months earlier. Hank stood tall and proud in a new suit ordered from Santa Fe, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face cleanly shaven for the occasion. When Naomi walked toward him in a dress of pale blue, silk her one extravagance, insisted upon by Hank, despite her protests about the cost, the love shining in his eyes, made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. "I take you, Naomi, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Hank vowed, his voice strong and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Naomi repeated the same vows, her heart so full it seemed impossible that her body could contain such happiness. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Hank's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, she knew with absolute certainty that the path that had begun on the courthouse steps had led exactly where she was meant to be. They returned to their homestead, now truly theirs together as husband and wife, ready to begin the next chapter of their life. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities: children to love, land to nurture, seasons to weather together. For Naomi, who had once stood trembling and bound on the auction block, freedom had come in the most unexpected form, not in solitary independence, but in the bonds of love freely chosen, in the commitment to build a life alongside the man who had seen her worth when others saw only a commodity. And for Hank, who had carried the weight of his sister's fate for so many years, redemption had come not through the gold he had paid that day in Fort Sumner, but through the woman who had taught him to open his heart again, to trust in love's healing power. Together, they had transformed what began as a transaction into a testament to love's ability to flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. Their story, which had started with 5 simple words, "Come on," would continue to unfold through all the days to come, written not in the ledgers of debt and payment, but in the shared moments of a life built on mutual respect, understanding, and abiding love. 10 years later, spring 1889, the apple trees were in full bloom, their delicate white blossoms releasing a sweet fragrance into the warm spring air. Naomi Ironwood stood beneath them, a basket over her arm, as she surveyed the orchard that had grown from the small saplings she and Hank had planted in those early days of their life together. "Mama, Mama, look what I found." Naomi turned to see her 8-year-old daughter, Hannah, running toward her, golden brown curls bouncing with each step, something clutched carefully in her small hands. "What is it, sweetheart?" Naomi asked, kneeling to meet her daughter at eye level. Hannah opened her hands to reveal a robin's egg, vivid blue against her pale skin. "It was on the ground under the big tree. Is it broken?" Naomi examined the egg carefully. "No, it looks whole, but we should put it back if we can find the nest." "Papa said he'd help me," Hannah said, closing her hands gently around the egg again. "He's showing Thomas how to mend the fence, but he said he'll come as soon as they're done." Naomi smiled at the mention of her son. At 10 years old, Thomas was the image of his father, serious and thoughtful, eager to learn everything about running the ranch that had grown substantially over the past decade. "Well, we shouldn't keep the mama bird waiting too long," Naomi said, stroking her daughter's cheek. "Let's go find your father." They walked hand in hand through the orchard, past the vegetable garden that now fed a family of 5, toward the expanded corral where Hank was indeed showing Thomas how to hammer a loose board back into place. "Look at you two," Naomi called as they approached. "Making good progress." Hank looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. The years had added a few strands of silver to his dark hair and etched fine lines around his eyes. But to Naomi, he was more handsome than ever, his face now marked by laughter as much as by the hardships of frontier life. "Just about finished," he replied, smiling at her in that way that still made her heart skip a beat. His gaze shifted to Hannah. "Did you show your mama what you found?" Hannah nodded eagerly, holding up her cupped hands. "We need to put it back in the nest. You promised to help." "So I did," Hank agreed, ruffling Thomas's hair. "Think you can finish this last nail, son?" Thomas straightened with pride. "Yes, sir." "That's my boy," Hank said, handing him the hammer. "Just remember what I showed you about keeping your thumb clear." Hank joined Naomi and Hannah, placing a gentle kiss on Naomi's cheek as he reached them. "How are my girls today?" "We're fine," Naomi replied, leaning into his touch. "But there's a mother bird out there who's probably frantic about her missing egg." "Can't have that," Hank said seriously. "Lead the way, Hannah." As their daughter skipped ahead toward the big cottonwood tree, Hank took Naomi's basket and offered his arm. "And how's our littlest one today?" he asked, his free hand gently touching Naomi's rounded belly. "Active," Naomi replied with a smile. "I think this one might be a girl. She's dancing all day long." "Just like her mama," Hank said, his eyes warm with memories of the evenings Naomi would play her harp and sometimes dance to traditional tunes from her childhood. They reached the cottonwood tree where Hannah was already pointing upward. "There, Papa, see the nest." Hank squinted against the sunlight filtering through the leaves. "I see it. That's a tall climb for a little girl." "But not for a tall papa," Hannah said confidently. Hank chuckled. "True enough." He handed the basket back to Naomi. "Hold this while I rescue a bird family." Naomi watched as he hoisted Hannah up so she could carefully transfer the egg to his shirt pocket, then set her down before beginning to climb the tree with the same agility he'd shown when they first met. Some things never changed, she thought with a smile. As Hank carefully returned the egg to its nest, Naomi's mind drifted back over the decade they had shared. It hadn't all been easy. There had been droughts and blizzards, a fire that nearly took the barn, a fever that had terrified them when Thomas was just 3. But through it all, their love had remained constant, growing stronger with each challenge faced together. The homestead had flourished under their care. What had been a simple cabin was now a proper house with 4 rooms, including a parlor where Naomi's harp had pride of place. The barn had been expanded, the herd of cattle increased, and Hank's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled horseman had spread throughout the territory. They were comfortable now, secure in a way Naomi could scarcely have imagined that day on the courthouse steps. "Mission accomplished," Hank announced as he dropped from a low branch to the ground. "One egg safely home." Hannah clapped her hands in delight. "Do you think the mama bird will come back?" "I'm sure she will," Naomi assured her. "Mothers don't abandon their babies." Hank's arm slid around Naomi's waist, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. "No," They certainly don't. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. They turned to see a rider approaching from the direction of the main road, a young man on a bay horse. "Looks like we have company," Hank observed, his posture straightening slightly, an old habit from years when unexpected visitors sometimes meant trouble. But as the rider drew closer, Naomi recognized him as the son of their nearest neighbors, the Millers. "It's just young James," she said, "probably with a message from his mother." Indeed, James Miller reined in his horse and touched his hat respectfully. "Afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Ironwood. Ma sent me over to remind you about the spring social at our place this Saturday. She says to tell you she won't take no for an answer this time, Mrs. Ironwood, even in your condition." Naomi laughed. Martha Miller had become a dear friend over the years, and her seasonal gatherings were legendary throughout the county. "Tell your mother we'll be there, James. I'm perfectly capable of sitting in a chair and enjoying the company." "Yes, madam. She'll be pleased to hear it." James shifted in his saddle. "Oh, and Pa wanted to let Mr. Ironwood know that the new stallion he bought from up north has arrived, if you'd like to come see him sometime this week." "I'll ride over tomorrow," Hank promised. The two men had developed a friendly rivalry regarding their respective horse breeding programs. After James departed with their message, the family made their way back toward the house. Thomas had finished the fence repair and joined them, proudly showing his father the completed work. "Well done," Hank praised, inspecting the mended section. "You're becoming quite the rancher." Thomas beamed under his father's approval. "Johnny Miller says his pa is teaching him to shoot next month when he turns 11. Can I learn too?" Hank and Naomi exchanged a glance, having already discussed this milestone. "We'll start lessons after your birthday," Hank agreed. "But remember what I've always told you, a gun is a tool, not a toy, and every bullet has consequences," Thomas recited dutifully. "I remember, Pa." "Good man," Hank said, clapping him on the shoulder. As they approached the house, a small figure appeared on the porch. Lucinda, their housekeeper and helper who had joined the household after the birth of Hannah. When it became clear that Naomi could use an extra pair of hands. "There you all are," the older woman called, her hands on her hips in mock severity. "Supper's nearly ready, and not a one of you cleaned up yet." "We're coming, Lucy," Naomi called back with a smile. Lucinda had become more like family than employee over the years. Her grandmotherly affection for the children, a blessing Naomi treasured. The family scattered to wash up for the evening meal, Thomas to the water pump in the yard, Hannah racing inside to use the basin in her room, Hank accompanying Naomi to their bedroom, where a pitcher and bowl awaited. As Naomi washed her hands and face, Hank came up behind her, his arms encircling her expanded waistline, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Happy," he murmured against her ear. Naomi turned in his embrace, her wet hands coming up to frame his beloved face. "Completely," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Are you?" Hank's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "More than I ever thought possible." His hand caressed her belly. "Though I'm still not sure how a desperate bid at a courthouse auction led to all this." "It was the best $300 you ever spent," Naomi teased, referencing a joke that had become familiar between them over the years. "Best investment of my life," Hank agreed, his tone shifting from playful to sincere. "Not for what it bought me, but for who it brought me." Naomi leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the heart that had recognized her worth that day long ago, the heart that had patiently won hers in return. "Come on," she said softly, echoing his words from that fateful day. "Our family's waiting." Hand in hand, they joined their children at the dinner table. taking their places in the life they had built together, a life of love, purpose, and belonging that had begun with an act of courage on the courthouse steps and blossomed into a legacy that would endure for generations to come.